What if a single, thoughtless gesture could unravel a lifetime of secrets? What if a forgotten piece of paper, used to scribble a lunch order, held the key to a hidden past and a future you never dared to imagine? For one waitress, a simple act of necessity was about to change everything. This is a story about a faded signature, a silent promise, and a test of character so demanding it could either shatter a life or forge a legacy. Elara traced the rim of a water glass with a damp cloth, the motion automatic, ingrained by 1,000 identical shifts. The low hum of the lunchtime rush at the Greystone Diner was the soundtrack to her life. A life of exhaustion, mounting bills, and the ever-present, gnawing worry for her mother. Her mother, whose cough seemed to echo in the quiet of their tiny apartment long after she'd fallen asleep, needed a surgery Elara couldn't possibly afford. Not on this salary. Not in this lifetime. Still, she smiled at her customers. She refilled their coffee, asked about their kids, and offered a genuine warmth that cost her nothing and yet was all she had to give. He sat in her quietest corner booth, a man who didn't belong. His suit was a slash of dark, expensive wool in a sea of worn denim and polyester. He hadn't looked at the menu, ordering a black coffee with a quiet authority that made her nervous. She knew who he was. Everyone in the city knew Alistair Vance, the reclusive billionaire at the helm of Vance Industries, a man who hadn't been photographed in public in over a decade. He looked older than in the file photos, his face etched with a profound loneliness that resonated with her own. When it was time for the bill, Elara reached under the counter for her notepad, but her hand came up empty. Flustered, she grabbed the next best thing. A loose sheet from a stack of old, brittle ledger paper she used for scrap. It was from a box of her grandmother's things. Its faint blue lines and elegant script a small, comforting link to the past. She quickly tallied the coffee and tax, tore the slip off, and placed it face down on his table. "Whenever you're ready, sir," she murmured, turning away before she saw him flip it over. Alistair Vance did not look at the total. His eyes, sharp and discerning, were fixed on the bottom of the page, just below Elara's hasty calculation. There, in faded ink, was a signature, a flourish of a pen he hadn't seen in 30 years, yet one that was burned into his memory like a brand. Arthur Vance Sr., his father's signature. His breath caught in his chest. Couldn't be. His father's personal effects, his records, his entire life had been locked away, archived, or so he thought. To see that name here on a greasy diner bill was like seeing a ghost. He looked up, his gaze locking onto the young waitress now clearing a nearby table. All thoughts of his schedule, of the multi-million-dollar deal waiting for his approval, vanished. There was only this slip of paper and the impossible question it posed. "Miss," he called out, his voice rougher than he intended. Elara turned, her expression a mixture of surprise and concern. She walked back to the booth. "Is everything all right?" Alistair held up the paper, his hand trembling almost imperceptibly. "Where did you get this?" Elara blinked, confused. "The bill? I wrote it down. I ran out of notepad paper. I'm so sorry if that's not your writing," he interrupted, pointing a finger at the signature. "This, down here. Where did this paper come from?" Her eyes followed his finger. "Oh, that is just some old paper. It belonged to my grandmother. She passed away a few years ago and left me a box of her things. Old ledgers from a place she used to work, I think. I just used them for scrap." His mind raced. His father. A ledger. A waitress's grandmother. The pieces made no sense, yet they felt like the tumblers of a lock clicking into place. This was not a coincidence. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw past the tired uniform. He saw her resilience, the quiet dignity in her posture. He saw a flicker of something familiar in her eyes. "I will give you $10,000, he said, the words stark in the diner's gentle hum. "For the box. For all the paper you have like this." Elara stared, speechless. $10,000. It was a lifeline. It was a miracle. It was her mother's medicine for months. "And I want you to bring it to my office tomorrow morning. At 9. We have more to discuss." He slid a business card across the table. its crisp edge a stark contrast to the worn laminate. "My assistant will be expecting you." That night, Alara's apartment felt smaller than ever, the silence punctuated by her mother's labored breathing from the other room. The $10,000 check Alistair had insisted on giving her as a down payment sat on the kitchen table, a piece of paper that felt heavier than gold. It was hope. It was also terrifying. She pulled the worn cardboard box from the back of her closet, dust motes dancing in the dim light. Inside were the ledgers, dozens of them. Their leather covers were cracked, the pages yellowed with age. She had never looked at them closely before. They were just objects, silent witnesses to a life her grandmother, Eleanor, had never spoken of. Now she opened one. The pages were filled with columns of numbers and descriptions of transactions for a company she'd never heard of, Sterling and Vance Textiles, and on page after page, at the bottom, was that same signature. Arthur Vance Sr., a signature that belonged to a man whose name was synonymous with power and tragedy. A man who had died decades ago. What was her grandmother, a humble bookkeeper, doing with the private ledgers of Alistair Vance's father? The next morning, Alara stood before Vance Tower, a steel and glass monolith that pierced the clouds. It was another world, a universe away from the Greystone diner. Dressed in her only nice blouse, she felt like an imposter. Inside, the lobby was a cavern of white marble and hushed efficiency. Alistair's assistant, a severe woman with an impeccably polite demeanor, escorted her to a private elevator that ascended without a sound. The doors opened directly into Alistair Vance's office. It was less an office and more a kingdom in the sky, with panoramic views of the city sprawling below. Alistair stood by the window, his back to her. He turned, his eyes immediately finding the box in her arms. "You came." "I did," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Set it on the table." He gestured to a massive mahogany desk. As she carefully placed the box down, he began to leaf through the first ledger, his fingers tracing the entries with a strange reverence. A story was here, a forgotten history, and for the first time in years, the cold, empty fortress of Alistair Vance's life felt like it had a ghost, a whisper of the past demanding to be heard. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt since he was a boy. Curiosity, mingled with a profound and unsettling hope. The heavy office door swung open without a knock, and a young man in a perfectly tailored suit strode in, a contemptuous smirk on his face. "Uncle, I've been trying to reach you. The board is getting antsy about the merger." He stopped short, his eyes landing on Alara, then on the dusty box of ledgers on the desk. His smirk soured into a sneer. "What is this? Did the archives send up their trash by mistake?" This was Marcus Vance, Alistair's nephew and the presumptive heir to the Vance empire. He moved with an air of entitled arrogance, viewing the world as his personal property. Alistair's expression hardened. "This is a private meeting, Marcus." "A meeting? With a waitress?" Marcus scoffed, circling the desk to get a closer look at Alara, appraising her as if she were a piece of furniture. "Don't tell me you've fallen for some sob story. Let me guess. She needs money for a sick relative, and just so happens to have found some long-lost family heirloom?" He picked up one of the ledger pages Alara had brought, the one with the original bill on it, and waved it dismissively. "This is a joke. Anyone can forge a signature. She's a common grifter, Uncle. You need to be more careful. People like her can smell money from a mile away." Alara flinched, color rising in her cheeks. She felt small, exposed. Every accusation he hurled felt designed to confirm her deepest insecurities, that she was nothing, that she didn't belong here, that her desperation was a flaw to be mocked. "That's not true," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I didn't ask for anything." He offered. "Oh, I'm sure he did," Marcus said, his voice dripping with condescension. "And you were just too noble to accept, I suppose? Get her out of here before she tries to slip a fountain pen in her purse." He turned to Alistair, his tone shifting to one of feigned concern. "You're not well, Uncle. You've been isolated for too long. It's making you vulnerable to parasites." But Alistair wasn't looking at Marcus. He was looking at Alara, watching her stand her ground, seeing the honest fire in her eyes. He had spent his life surrounded by people like Marcus, people who saw transactions, not humanity, people who measured worth in dollars, not character. He saw none of that in this young woman. "Marcus, that is enough," Alistair said, his voice low and dangerous. "Leave." Now Marcus's eyes widened in disbelief. "But I will not say it again." The command was absolute. Defeated and seething with humiliation, Marcus shot Alara a look of pure venom before turning on his heel and storming out of the office, slamming the door behind him. The silence he left behind was heavy. Alara stood frozen, her hands clenched at her sides. Alistair finally turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I apologize for my nephew. He lacks perspective." He gestured for her to sit, and together, they turned their attention back to the box, the silent arbiter of a history that one man desperately wanted to uncover, and another would do anything to keep buried. Alistair and Alara spent the next hour in quiet concentration, carefully examining the ledgers. The pages documented the birth and early struggles of Sterling and Vance Textiles. Alistair spoke softly, explaining that his father, Arthur, had been the heart of the company, the innovator, while his partner, a man named Jonathan Sterling, handled the finances. The partnership had dissolved acrimoniously 30 years ago, with Sterling buying Arthur out for a shockingly low sum just before the company exploded into a global powerhouse. Arthur Vance had died a year later, a broken man. The official story was a heart attack, but Alistair had always suspected it was from a broken spirit. As he gently turned a brittle page in the third ledger, something slipped from between the sheets and fluttered onto the polished desk. It was a letter, folded into a small, tight square. The paper softened with age. Alara's breath hitched. The handwriting was the same elegant script as the signature. Alistair picked it up as if it were a sacred relic and carefully unfolded it. It was addressed to "My dearest Eleanor," Alara's grandmother. His voice was a low murmur as he began to read aloud. "Eleanor, if you are reading this, it means I have failed. Sterling has won. He has backed me into a corner, using lies and threats to force my hand. He has stolen my company, my life's work, but I will not let him steal my legacy. I have made arrangements, a terrible choice for a terrible time, but the only one that ensures safety." Alistair paused, his knuckles white as he gripped the letter. He continued, his voice strained. "He does not know about our precious gift, our boy. I have entrusted him to your family, to be raised far from this poisoned world, far from my name. It breaks my heart to do this, to give him up, but it is the only way to protect him from the ruin Sterling has planned for me. One day, I pray I can make this right. One day, the truth will come out. Keep these records for me. They are the only proof of what was stolen. Yours always, Arthur." The room was silent save for the distant city sounds. A son. Arthur Vance had another son, a brother Alistair never knew he had. A boy given to Alara's grandmother's family to raise in secret. The precious gift wasn't a thing. It was a person. Alara stared at Alistair, her mind reeling. Her grandmother had never married, never spoken of a man. But her mother had been adopted by Eleanor's sister. A quiet arrangement no one ever questioned. Could it be? The implications were staggering. A tidal wave of history crashing down on them in the sterile quiet of the penthouse office. The faded signature on a scrap of paper was no longer a simple curiosity. It was a testament. It was the first breadcrumb on a trail leading to a hidden life, a stolen birthright, and a secret that could either heal a broken family or tear the Vance empire apart. News of the Waitress and her box of old books traveled quickly through the executive floors of Vance Tower. Marcus, enraged and paranoid, saw his inheritance slipping through his fingers. He could not allow this nobody to worm her way into his uncle's life, to dredge up the past and disrupt the orderly succession he had been planning for years. He summoned his assistant, a man as ambitious and morally flexible as himself. "I want to know everything about her," Marcus commanded. "Alara Reyes. I want to know where she lives, who she knows, every dollar she's ever owed. Dig up anything you can find. I want to prove she is exactly what she appears to be, A desperate gold digger within a day, Marcus had a dossier. It was a grim portrait of a life lived on the edge, student loans, her mother's staggering medical debts, a notice of a pending eviction. It was the perfect narrative. He marched into Alistair's office and threw the file on his desk. "Here," he announced. "Here is your mystery girl. A life of debt and desperation. This isn't about some long-lost history, uncle. It's a shakedown, plain and simple." Alistair barely glanced at the papers. "Her circumstances do not define her character." Marcus, seeing his uncle unmoved, Marcus decided on a more direct approach. He found Alara at the diner during the slow hours before the evening rush. He slid into her booth, his presence casting a cold shadow. He placed a briefcase on the table and opened it. Inside were stacks of cash. $250,000, he said, his voice low and smooth. "Tax-free. Enough to solve all your problems. Your mother's surgery, a new apartment, a new life. Anything you want." Alara stared at the money, her heart pounding. It was an impossible sum. It was freedom. It was the answer to every prayer she'd whispered in the dark. "What do I have to do?" she asked, her voice tight. "Disappear," Marcus said simply. "Give my uncle the rest of the ledgers and walk away. Sign a non-disclosure agreement stating this was all a misunderstanding. Forget you ever met him. Forget the name Vance." This was her test. The temptation was immense, a physical ache in her chest. She saw her mother's face, saw a life free from the constant, crushing weight of poverty. But then she saw her grandmother's face, a woman of quiet strength and unshakable integrity. She thought of the letter, of the heartbroken words of a father forced to give up his son. This was bigger than money. It was about truth. She looked Marcus dead in the eye and slowly pushed the briefcase back across the table. "No," his smile faltered. "Don't be a fool. My grandmother kept these records for a reason," Alara said, her voice gaining strength. "She held onto a promise for 30 years. Her memory and that promise are not for sale." She stood up, took the briefcase and walked it back to him. "Now I have to get back to work. You should leave." Marcus stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He had offered her the world, and she had chosen principle. As he stormed out of the diner, he didn't notice Alistair Vance's car parked across the street, or the man in the driver's seat who had just watched the entire exchange with a renewed, unshakable conviction. Convinced of Alara's integrity and more determined than ever, Alistair unleashed the full force of his resources. He hired a team of the best private investigators in the country, their task singular and clear: uncover the truth of what happened to Sterling and Vance Textiles and find any living trace of the boy his father had written about. The investigators worked with surgical precision, disappearing into city archives and legal vaults. They started with Jonathan Sterling, the old business partner, now a titan of industry living in ostentatious retirement. While his public records were clean, his private ones were not. The team discovered a hidden storage unit, and after navigating a maze of legal hurdles, they gained access. Inside was a treasure trove of betrayal. They found Sterling's old personal files, containing drafts of letters and memos from 30 years ago. In them, Sterling detailed his plan to systematically ruin Arthur Vance. He had fabricated evidence of embezzlement, threatened to leak the false story to the press, and used the manufactured scandal to force Arthur to sell his shares for almost nothing. It was a cold, calculated corporate assassination. But the most damning discovery was a personal journal. In an entry dated a week after Arthur's death, Sterling had written with chilling arrogance, "The fool is gone. He never even suspected I knew about the bookkeeper and the boy. He thought his little secret was safe. He sacrificed his empire for nothing." The investigators then turned their focus to Alara's family tree, following the path laid out in Arthur's letter. They traced the adoption records of Alara's mother, finding she had been placed with Eleanor's sister shortly after her birth. But the real breakthrough came from a DNA sample Alara willingly provided. They compared it to a sample taken from one of Arthur Vance's old hairbrushes, preserved in Alistair's private collection. The results were irrefutable. Alara was not directly Arthur's descendant. The DNA showed that Alara was the daughter of the man who was Arthur's son, The connection was one step removed. The boy, Arthur's secret child, had been named Daniel Reyes. He had grown up, married, and had a daughter, Alara. He had died in a car accident when she was only 5, a tragedy that had left her and her mother to fend for themselves. Alistair Vance sat in his office, the final report spread before him. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. He had not lost a brother in some unknown tragedy. He had a nephew, Daniel, who had lived and died without ever knowing his true heritage. And now he had a grandniece, Alara, the last of his family, the only living link to the brother he never knew. The weight of 30 stolen years of a family denied settled upon him. It was no longer just about uncovering the past. It was about reclaiming a future. The air in the Vance Industries boardroom was thick with tension. The long, polished table reflected the grim faces of the board members Alistair had summoned for an emergency meeting. At one end sat Jonathan Sterling, elderly but still radiating a predatory stillness. Beside him, Marcus Vance looked smug, confident that his uncle's bizarre obsession was about to be publicly quashed. He had spent the last week poisoning the board against Alistair, painting him as an unstable recluse being manipulated by a con artist. Alara sat quietly beside Alistair, her presence a stark anomaly in this den of corporate power. She was nervous but resolute. Alistair began without preamble. For 30 years, this company has been built on a lie, he stated, his voice echoing in the silent room. He laid the first ledger on the table. A lie that began with the theft of my father's legacy. He systematically presented the evidence. He showed them the ledgers, the proof of his father's foundational work. He read Arthur's heart-wrenching letter aloud, his voice cracking with emotion. He then projected the pages from Sterling's journal onto the large screen at the end of the room, a confession in the architect's own hand. Sterling's face went pale, his composure finally cracking. "These are fabrications," he blustered. "Arthur was a weak, sentimental fool who couldn't handle the pressure. I built this empire. You built it on the foundations of a good man you destroyed," Alistair countered, his voice like ice. He then turned his gaze to his nephew. "And it seems the rot doesn't fall far from the tree." On the screen, a new set of documents appeared, emails and bank records showing a secret collaboration between Marcus and Sterling's sons. Marcus had been feeding them inside information, planning a hostile takeover to oust Alistair and seize control for himself. He was betraying his own family, just as Sterling had done a generation before. Marcus's face drained of all color. He was exposed. "And finally," Alistair said, his voice softening as he looked at Alara, "the reason for this meeting, the legacy my father died to protect." He displayed the DNA report on the screen. The lines and markers were indecipherable to most, but the conclusion was clear. "Alara Reyes is the daughter of my brother, Daniel Reyes, born Arthur Vance Jr. She is my grandniece. And she is the rightful heir to the 50% of this company that was stolen from our family." A collective gasp went through the room. The confrontation was complete. The truth, suppressed for decades, had finally erupted, shattering careers and fortunes in a single, devastating moment. The fallout was swift and absolute. The board, faced with irrefutable proof of Sterling's founding treachery and Marcus's contemporary betrayal, voted unanimously. Jonathan Sterling was stripped of his honorary titles and his family's shares were forcibly bought out, the scandal wiping out decades of carefully curated respectability and leaving his name in ruins. He left the boardroom a disgraced relic, his empire built on lies crumbling around him. Marcus Vance was fired immediately, escorted from the building by security. Alistair disinherited him on the spot, severing all personal and financial ties. The entitled nephew who had mocked Alara for her poverty was now left with nothing but his own bitterness, a ghost in the corporate world he once sought to rule. In a press conference that shocked the financial world, Alistair Vance publicly acknowledged the truth. He told the story of his father's betrayal and introduced Alara as the newest member of the Vance family. He established a trust in her name, transferring the full value of her grandfather's stolen shares into it, making her wealthier than she could ever have comprehended. Her first act was not to buy a mansion or a sports car, but to ensure her mother received the best medical care on the planet, flying in specialists to perform the surgery she so desperately needed. The weight of the world was lifted from Alara's shoulders, replaced by a sense of security, belonging, and profound, cathartic justice. The final scene was not set in a boardroom or a penthouse, but in a sun-drenched garden at a private recovery facility. Alara's mother, frail but smiling, sat wrapped in a warm blanket, watching the birds with a peacefulness Alara hadn't seen in years. Alara sat beside her, holding her hand, while Alistair stood nearby, no longer a reclusive billionaire but a quiet man rediscovering the simple warmth of family. The sterile opulence of his old life had been replaced by this genuine connection. He had found the legacy his father had died for, not in stock prices or corporate towers, but in the resilience and integrity of his grandniece. The past had been redeemed, the future rewritten. A life of struggle had been transformed into a life of purpose. This story reminds us that truth has a way of rising to the surface, no matter how deeply it is buried. It teaches us that integrity is a currency more valuable than any fortune, and that the connections that bind us are stronger than the greed that seeks to tear us apart. How many forgotten stories and hidden promises lie dormant in the old boxes of our own lives, just waiting for the right moment to change everything? If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the power of truth and family, please like, share, and subscribe for more inspirational content.